How does Jesus encounter us? Through every part of the Bible. The strange, the difficult parts, the parts we find comforting, and the parts that are not that easy to preach from. Join the Living Church in Oklahoma City this September for Radiant Pages, Rediscovering the Bible, a 3-day conference designed to empower lay people and clergy alike to read the Bible with greater skill, care, and confidence. In keynotes, conversation, and practical workshops, we'll delve into questions like, is there an Anglican way to read Scripture? Do Christians still really need the Old Testament? Did Paul preach the same gospel as Jesus? How can I encounter Christ in devotional reading and reading for preaching? Come rediscover the Bible for you, for today, in the communion of the church across time. For more information or to register for this September 2026 conference, visit livingchurch.org/events or click the link in the show notes of the most recent episode.
Here's the thing. Conferences don't change things. Synods change things. Conferences don't build common life. Synods do. At least that's what 2,000 years of church history has told us. So I think the question is, can Gafcon keep running revival meetings and saying it's a communion? I think they're going to have to develop a synodical structure if they want to live up to the vision in some of their rhetoric. They might choose not to, in which case churches that really feel that the call to union drives them to deeper engagement, well, they will go to GSFA and hopefully to the Canterbury Instruments of Communion as well.
The Living Church, serving the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion since 1878. Welcome to the Living Church podcast. Welcome back, podcast listeners, and happy continued Easter to you. First of all, I want to make an announcement. This just tickles me, and it makes me so grateful for your listenership. We're now an award-winning podcast. How about that? Episcopal communicators have given us a Polybond Award of Merit for our Newsdesk episode on Gafcon last fall. We'll include a link in the show notes if you want to revisit that episode. Thank you so much, Episcopal communicators, for that honor, and thanks to all of you listeners for your support in what we're doing. And speaking of support, if you want to support the podcast in an even more concrete way, you can donate to the Living Church. $10 a month for a year covers production costs, I did the math, for one episode of the podcast. There's also a link in the show notes to give if you're ready to make a small commitment each month, or maybe you just want to give a one-time donation as a thank you for what we're doing over here. Every bit helps us bring this show to you in a thoughtful, creative, and timely way. Now, last fall's Newsdesk episode is a great segue because we've been wanting to do more of these episodes. And ta-da, if you've seen the title of this episode, yes, today is another Newsdesk. We want to make this a new and regular feature of the podcast. TLC editor Mark Michael and executive director Matthew Olver join me in the studio to summarize, analyze, and generally chat about 3 significant recent news items. And then at the end, we have a bonus segment for you that includes some Eastertide treats. Before we jump in, we'll be talking quite a bit more today about the Global Anglican Communion launched by Gafcon and questions and issues surrounding recent developments. In light of that, I wanted to briefly define an acronym that we've used frequently in these conversations, GSFA, in case we use that acronym at some point and don't define it right away. The GSFA is the Global South Fellowship of Anglican Churches. It's an organization whose members have some overlap with Gafcon, but it's a different organization. And this is how they define their movement from their website. The GSFA is a worldwide fellowship of Orthodox Anglican provinces and dioceses within the Anglican Communion. So we often refer to the GSFA when comparing and contrasting their different approaches with Gafcon, their different approaches to theology, ecclesiology, or Christian unity. I want to just point you all to the show notes for a plethora of articles, essays, and resources in relation to today's conversations, including some corresponding goodies from our bonus segment. Finally, let me just give a shout out to the most recent issue of the Living Church magazine. If you're not a subscriber, you can do that really easily at livingchurch.org and click subscribe. The most recent issue is our Spring Books and Culture issue. We have a beautiful spread on the new Archbishop's enthronement. We've got a profile on the new dean of Berkeley at Yale. We take you inside a Myanmar seminary, and we've got books and books and books. It's our spring book issue after all. Our book reviews include an exploration of art inspired by the book Revelation, Eleanor Roosevelt's prayer life, and a Texas seminary whodunit. Now, get comfy in your metal roller chair, adjust your earpiece, pat your hair, and tap the edges of your notes even. Here comes the countdown. You have joined us for another Newsdesk. We hope you enjoy the conversation. You want to just jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Mark, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me back at the Newsdesk today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Great to be here with you.
So our news items, we've got 3 on the Newsdesk today. And one of them is about the Abuja Affirmation and a plethora of covenant articles that are coming out about the Abuja Affirmation, Gafcon, the Global Anglican Communion, and what this all means for global Anglicanism and Anglican communion. And then we have another story about a Rwandan bishop who has spent some time in jail for grazing his cattle on church property. Then there's a new church growth survey, a new Episcopal church growth survey that's just come out that sounds like it's pretty unique. The story that it's hoping to tell is really interesting. So we're going to do some talking about that as well. I'd love to start with the Abuja Affirmation and recent clarifications about the newly established Global Anglican Communion. First of all, what's the story here? And I wonder, Matthew, if you could take the lead on this.
Sure, absolutely. Mark and I have both written about this, actually. Here's the short of it. In early March of this year, it was over 300 Anglican bishops, over 100 lay and clerical leaders that represented 27 provinces, some of them that are formally a part of the Anglican Communion, some of that are not, gathered in Abuja, Nigeria. And this was a meeting that was convened by Gafcon, which is the abbreviation for the Global Anglican Futures Conference. They called this the G26 conference. So this is one of many gatherings that Gafcon has held, and these have been organized in response to especially developments around human sexuality, around the Anglican Communion, and their concerns that this expresses a rejection of biblical authority. So going into the meeting, I think most people were expecting, and they had kind of suggested this would be the case, that they would elect a rival to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And they did not do that. And in place of that, they rebranded their Primates Council as the leadership organization for this Global Anglican Communion. And the leadership team is called the Global Anglican Council. And they re-elected leaders that would serve on this role for the next 2 years. So this was also quite surprising because it introduces non-bishops into a leadership role for a global group, which is somewhat new, but the Anglican Consultative Council also does that. So that's worth noting. There's a precedent for something like this. They also produced a statement called the Abuja Affirmation, and this formalized the launch of what they're calling the Global Anglican Communion. They had fronted this name at a meeting back in October of last year. Now, there's a couple of things that I think are quite noteworthy about this.
Okay, yeah, that was my next question is like, what's the significance?
What does this matter?
Yeah, what does this matter?
Well, I think last October, the announcement made a lot of people think they were creating an alternate Anglican Communion. And That's probably a pretty plain reading of what they said. It's very clear from their statement that's not what they did, because they made it clear that you can be a member of the Anglican Communion in communion with Canterbury and be a member of the Global Anglican Communion. So the way you do that, all you have to do is sign on to the Jerusalem Declaration, and you're a part of the Global Anglican Communion.
Doesn't that feel like kind of a step back from what we originally thought was going to happen? Yeah, at least in a couple ways, in the leadership, but then also in the fact that, because that was one of y'all's big concerns when we talked last year, was that this was going to really be a blow for maybe Global South dioceses who theologically are aligned with Gafcon or with the Global Anglican Communion, but are like, we're in historical communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. We have a history here. We've got, a relationship that involves finances, that involves practical support. We can't just pull out. And am I right in hearing that that's not how it's actually going to be? You can keep those connections. You just have to sign the Jerusalem Declaration.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now, to be a part of the leadership council, you must be fully disengaged from the four instruments of communion. So Lambeth Conference, the Primates meeting, and the Archbishop of Canterbury herself. So I think a lot of people were very surprised by that. It seemed like a huge step back, or a decision to not make a huge step forward, depending on how you look at it. And I think from the reporting that Mark did, I think it's clear that lots of people at the event itself were quite surprised by what it did not do. Is that fair, Mark?
That's right. I mean, George Conger, who was on the scene there, said that the announcement that a primus, a single lead bishop, that a primus would not be chosen really deflated most of the delegates. He quoted Archbishop Duncan, the former Archbishop of the Anglican Church in North America, saying that, the Global Anglican Communion needs a Catholic ecclesiology, and that would be, in his mind, equated with choosing a single archbishop to serve as its symbolic head. And though there is an Archbishop Mabanda of Rwanda, who is still the chair of the Global Anglican Council, they've also clearly said that they don't envision this communion as really having synodical or legal powers. It's not really meant to exercise any significant authority over its members. It's not, for example, a body for the purpose of deepening their ecclesial bonds, like, say, the Global South Fellowship of Anglicans Covenant. It's really just a list of people who affirm the Jerusalem Declaration. And then if you want to have any authority within it, you have to commit to disengaging. So it's, in some ways, I think it's like, say, Lutheranism or Dutch Calvinism, or, churches that define their identity solely around a confessional document. In Europe, in many places, for example, they didn't used to call themselves the Lutheran Church. They would call themselves the Church of the Augsburg Confession. This is essentially saying, what we call it the Global Anglican Communion, but really it's the Church of the Jerusalem Declaration. And then there's that added thing that the one commitment for serving in leadership in this Global Anglican Communion is refusing to be in communion with the majority of Anglicans. I mean, this is a very strange commitment to me, and it seems very backward-looking. But that's, in effect, how Gafcon has understood and defined its identity for a long time. And, I think this idea that churches could have a foot in both camps, I mean, in my reading, that's there in the Jerusalem Declaration. And when Gafcon says we've affirmed that could be the case, that's been the case for a long time. I mean, the Diocese of Sydney has always had a central role in Gafcon, and it's the largest and by many measures the healthiest diocese in the Anglican Church of Australia. It's not going anywhere. It's always been in that position. So I think when I first read the Martyrs' Day statement, I thought they're really drawing a line in the sand here, and they want everyone to take a step back from that having a foot in both camps. And that would have been radical and innovative, and of course also deeply unifying. But they didn't do that. And in a sense, that's just being faithful to their own principles and perhaps having a sense of the kind of upheaval and drama that would cause. I think the other factor that you didn't mention is my read is that really by drawing that line in the sand, they were trying to put a squeeze, we might say, on those 7 Anglican provinces that are actively involved or have been until recently in the both Gafcon and the GSFA, um, provinces like Alexandria, South Sudan,
Congo, Kenya.
Congo, Kenya, right. And so I think they were trying to say basically, now's the moment for you to withdraw from the Anglican Communion's instruments and join us instead in sitting out. We, Rwanda, Nigeria, and Uganda, who've been doing this basically for 20 years. They got one province, Chile, but they didn't get the other 6. Some of those primates, I don't think, had really been engaged in GAFCON for a long time. Yes, their churches had signed the declaration, the Jerusalem Declaration. Yes, they have much common theologically, but they've refused this call to disunity thus far. There are parts of this that seem strange and complicated, but there are parts of it that are just clear and consistent. If we thought the Global Anglican Communion was going to make everything in Anglican life completely clear, we've just been served up another nice, rich helping of Anglican fudge here.
That's one for the books.
There's a sentence I think really important in the affirmation that sums up what Mark just said. That is this. It says, true communion is confessional rather than defined by a shared history or institutional structures.
See, that's what I was going to ask about. Let's say I'm a diocese who is in communion with Canterbury, but I want to be part of the Global Anglican Communion. If I can maintain communion with Canterbury and still join with them in this in confessional agreement and confessional concord, if it's a confessional thing and I'm not breaking communion, like what would be the big deal?
There's a way in which signing the Jerusalem Declaration is a way of registering a deep conviction about the nature of the Bible, the nature of God-given human sexuality, things like that. I think in practice, those who, say are in that status where they don't qualify for the Global Anglican Council leadership, but they're still in GAFCON, I mean, how much engagement do they really have? I think that's the question. So they're no longer being really consulted when decisions are made. We don't know. They may develop, more structures over time. But as of right now, you're kind of in something in the sense that you count in its numbers when it wants to make talking points in an interview, but you don't actually have any role in shaping its voice. This is not a body that has like a big assembly where they take votes, like say they do in the GSFA. So you can be in the GSFA and participate in its structures, and they're committed to the same understanding of the scriptures and human sexuality. And yet there's not this requirement that you disengage. So I just don't see what the advantage of belonging to the Global Anglican Communion, if you're already part of the Anglican Communion, really might be. I mean, GAFCON is, up until now, they've defined themselves as a movement, and they've been really good at putting on conferences and encouraging church planning, and I'm sure they're still good at all those same things. I think the change, as we saw it, they were going to also become, we thought, an ecclesial structure. And now they've said, oh, actually, we don't mean that. I mean, to me, why would you still call yourself the Global Anglican Communion? I think that's mainly because of the anxieties of those churches founded by Gafcon that have never been part of the Anglican Communion. I think a lot of this still is about the legitimation for the ACNA of its anxieties about not being properly Anglican, because the ACNA has never been in communion with Canterbury. So you build up this language, you kind of present yourself as if you are a new communion. I'm just not sure how convincing that is for anybody, but if that helps you, I mean, maybe it helps you.
It seems there's a history, especially in GAFCON, of anticipating something dramatic. And then when they actually come to make the decision or issue the statement, it's less radical than everyone's expecting. Trying to figure out what's happening there is interesting. Like, who is exercising the influence of not going as far as it seems like they're going to go? I think that some of it is that there are many in the global south whose connection with Canterbury and England is significant for a complex array of reasons. Even in terms of things like diplomacy and safety, physical safety, negotiating, protection for churches, things like that. When you have the British government and a globally recognized figure providing assistance, that's not a small thing. The shared history actually really is a big deal. These missionary movements and the sacrifice that many missionaries made, they had an English prayer book until they had an indigenous prayer book. Like all these things, whatever you can say, they don't matter, but I think it's like telling people like, well, your family doesn't really matter. But most people, whatever you kind of say about that, you feel it. And that disengagement, I think, is a big deal. And maybe some of it is when push comes to shove, there's a deep concern about that. I mean, it was fascinating, too, in the dialogues after the Nairobi-Cairo proposal was put forward. And that's a proposal within the Anglican Communion proper about one of the things is to not have Canterbury as central in the leadership of the communion. Many conservative provinces were concerned about that. And I think that was maybe unexpected because many people thought, oh, well, that would assuage their concerns. But I think that this familial shared history thing and political connections both exercise very significant influence in how they both think, but also how they feel about these relational connections. And I think that also gets at the fact that communion is a very complicated, multifaceted reality. It's not like a light switch. You're in or out, you have it or you don't have it. I mean, you can be disengaged from a sibling for 10 years, but the fact is you are still connected to your sibling in all sorts of ways, even if you actually haven't talked in the last 10 years.
That's part of what that excellent covenant piece by Jeremy Worthen, who was previously one of the Church of England's chief ecumenical officers, pointed out very helpfully, is this phrase that Gafcon uses of the communion being voluntary, that's just a strange term, especially for Anglicans. I mean, I think what's meant is that what really matters is the concurrence of our opinions, and that can kind of be isolated from history, that can be isolated from the ways in which we impact each other through our synodical and governance structures. I think it's a very strange choice of words, and I don't really see much of an Anglican pedigree for it. But perhaps that is what we're dealing with. That may actually be an accurate term, but I just don't know that I would call it communion. I think I might call it voluntary association. Communion is a much thicker, richer. Communion is something that changes you, in a way that just happening to share the same opinion does not. It often happens that when we use language, eventually, even if we don't mean it fully at first, we end up kind of rising to its meaning. And so I think it's an interesting thing for Gafcon to say, well, we are a communion, but really we're not, but we're still going to call ourselves a communion. So is that seeding something where actually these deeper structures and shared history will actually become more important over time? I think it's an interesting question.
I think the question that I'm leaving this conversation with, in terms of where the news is at right now, communion is fleshly. Communion is tangible. It has to do with bodies sharing, being in the same space. And so one of the questions I've had is, I wonder, as the Global Anglican Communion develops as a group, if they're wanting to operate as a communion or something approaching a real communion, then when they are, wherever they are, physically gathering together, are these spaces also going to be open at some point, and when and where, for building bridges between Gafcon's leaders who continue to have very legitimate concerns about Anglican faithfulness and the people who understand that and are working on measures like the Nairobi-Cairo proposals? So that was a long way of saying, what are the literal places that they might be able to meet and have communion, to know each other, to worship together, to share dinner, to share their stories to build trust. Maybe that's a little bit Anne of Green Gables, but if you're going to call yourself a communion, then that should be the goal is.
This is actually a very important question. And I remember having a conversation when I was at the last GSFA, Global South Fellowship of Anglicans Assembly. I asked him, I said, why is the Church of Nigeria not participating in the GSFA? Because they share, there's so many common commitments. This was a bishop who had spent time in West Africa and sort of, would have an opinion. And he said, well, Nigerians don't like to go to synod. And he said they like Gafcon because when they go to Gafcon, it's a great conference and there are big speakers from the front. And I'm sure there are lots of Nigerians who like to go to synod. But Gafcon has operated in a register that's like conferences with lots of, headline people. You get everybody jazzed up. It's exciting. And synods are expensive. They take time. There's legislative process that happens. But here's the thing, conferences don't change things. Synods change things. Conferences don't build common life. Synods do. At least that's what 2,000 years of church history has told us. I mean, the conference is basically like a revival meeting, and the synod is a synod, right? These are two different kinds of things. And so I think the question is, can Gafcon keep running revival meetings and saying it's a communion? I don't think so. I think they're going to have to develop a synodical structure if they want to live up to the vision in some of their rhetoric. They might choose not to, in which case churches that really feel that the call to union drives them to deeper engagement, well, they will go to GSFA and hopefully to the Canterbury Instruments of Communion as well.
I think something else that plays into this, and I think you can actually see this more widely in general, the political register, not just in this country, but in different countries. I think that meeting and gathering has become identified with the left, definitive action being kind of associated with the right, because it's very difficult to make sense in some ways of why the central Gafcon primates haven't showed up at these instruments of communion. Because from a practical side, you could say, well, if they were all there, they actually could have affected a lot more. I think there's maybe something dispositional as well that plays into this. Again, their definition of communion being entirely confessional. Part of why people come to love ecumenism or love working for unity is when they get to know and care about people in different places with whom they're divided. That actually lights a fire in them to try to do something. The 2008 Lambeth Conference probably played into this with, less legislation and more, conversation. That was seen as a kind of liberal way to tamp down the ability of the bishops to make a decision and, speak definitively.
If you were a cynical person, you would say the reason for that was that in 1998, the Lambeth Conference did take action and it passed Lambeth 110, which was the only piece of communion-wide legislation that ever came from the Global South. And a certain kind of, disenchanted Global South leader would say, and they're never going to let us do that again.
The two Lambeth conferences that followed made that very clear. When the Global South people tried to speak at the last Lambeth Conference, they literally were silenced and not allowed to. And when they raise things like colonialism, it's not just things that are 150 years ago. It's like the last Lambeth Conference.
For more than 80 years, the mission of St. Francis Ministries has been to provide healing and hope to children and families. Inspired by the past and rooted in faith, their vision is to see lives and systems transformed. But they can't do it alone. You can join them in their life-affirming ministry. St. Francis provides a wide array of services ranging from foster care and adoption to preventative and residential programs. Join their mission and help ensure children and youth receive the care they need to heal and rediscover hope. Join their mission and help families heal and regain wholeness. Join their mission and help heal the world one child at a time. They have lots of ways you can make a difference. You can explore them all at stfrancisministries.org/mission. That's St. Francis, SAINT, francisministries.org/mission. I just want to point everyone who's listening again to the show notes of this episode, where we're going to have posted all these articles about Gafcon, the Abuja Affirmation, all the essays from Covenant, and go visit the show notes, read up if you want to read up more. Okay, next story. I'm going to turn to Mark for the details on this one. He's been covering this one also very closely. There's a bishop who has been in jail, who recently got out of jail. There's been some developments there. A Rwandan bishop who is using church land to graze 19 head of cattle. And it became like quite a drama in the diocese and beyond the diocese. First, can you just tell us more about this?
First, I really have to give credit to Daniel Sitole, who is our reporter who covers a lot of Eastern and Southern and Central African news. This issue, which involves Bishop Samuel Mugisha, formerly Bishop of the Diocese of Shaira in Rwanda, I mean, it's the situation basically was that he succeeded the Archbishop, Laurent Mambada, when he became primate in 2018. There was a complaint about two of his diocesan priests. One of them was the diocesan secretary. His name was Charles Kabwayo, and he had been Mabanda's secretary before, and then he was Mugisha's secretary. And Mugisha dismissed him and accused him of corruption and having debts and things like this. And then Kabwayo appealed his sentence to the archbishop, which is something that he could do under their kind of church disciplinary system. And then what happened is that the archbishop convened several meetings of the House of Bishops to try to resolve this issue, but he never invited Mugisha to testify on his own behalf. So they're talking about what he has done without him in the room. And some have said that that's an uncanonical way to do business in the Church of Rwanda. And in the end, he said that we can't solve this problem and it has to be handed over to the state. Now, that's an issue because Rwanda is a very closed state in many ways. It's had a one-party government for many years. The Archbishop, many people say, is very close with the president, Paul Kagame. They're from the same tribe. And so they handed this over to the Rwanda Governance Board. And the Rwanda Governance Board basically put Bishop Mugisha on trial and ended up accusing him of corruption. There were several charges against him. Only one of them stuck. And this was a charge that it was about pasturing cattle on church land. Now, this sounds like a very strange thing to us, but in parts of Rwanda, they've been herdsmen forever. And so these 19 cattle were given to him at his consecration in 2018 by his people as a culturally relevant sign of leadership. That, this is a very meaningful thing. And apparently his supporters say that the guy who accused him was also pasturing cattle in the same pasture. Nonetheless, they hand down this sentence that he should serve 3.5 years in jail for this crime. And he appeals it. Finally, the appeal is heard. About last week, the verdict comes down. He has a suspended sentence, so he's been released from jail. He's resigned as the Bishop of Shaira. Presumably, who knows if he can resume his ministry in some other way. His life has certainly been impacted in a profound way. And not only that, but several of the retired bishops, including the retired primate of Rwanda, have spoken out publicly against this, saying that the archbishop is abusing his power, that this kind of thing happens in our culture all the time, that people give cattle to priests and then priests pasture them on church land. And also there has been a lawsuit filed against the archbishop for abusing power and is accusing him that he's too old to serve in his office because he's 7 years past the mandatory retirement age. That case is still to be heard. So we're dealing with a province that has a lot of influence in the Gafcon movement. I mean, Mabanda is the head of the Global Anglican Communion, or at least the chair of the Global Anglican Council. It's a province that a lot of the rest of global Anglicans are connected to, especially in the ACNA, because it played a role in founding some of the ACNA mission work in the U.S., the AMIA. And I think that the tensions that are being raised there which are compounded by the fact that it's a state with such an authoritarian government, are not likely to go away. So, I mean, you can say on one hand, yes, a bishop is thrown in jail for where he pastures his cattle. That seems silly. But these are weighty, deep issues. You know, lots of our brothers and sisters are trying to conduct the business of the church in states that are relatively unfree and oppressive by our lights in comparison with our situation. And these people do need our prayers, and hopefully they can get this sorted out.
This directly connects, as Mark noted at the end, to our first story, in that the primate who's at the center of this contested question has exercised and was just reelected to exercise leadership as the senior archbishop in the Global Anglican Communion. As far as we can tell, he's serving 7 years past mandatory retirement age. That's remarkable. Like, it's impossible. Mark and I have both had people in different contexts. Africans tell us that the archbishop or the primate of Rwanda is considered by many people the second most powerful person in Rwanda, next to the president.
Wow.
The person who's been president for 26 years and was a major player in the Rwandan genocide.
The Global Anglican Council, one of their recent things is they changed the rules so that Mabande can continue to be the chair even after he retires. Most people say he will retire this year. Obviously, he's a man who has great gifts, who has impressed many. But it seems an unusual choice, especially to change the rules to allow him to continue in the role.
Well, on to our third story of the Newsdesk. This is a story about a new church growth survey. So I'm gonna tee us up here. The Reverend Christopher Corbin of the Diocese of Wisconsin, along with Forward Movement, they got it in their heads to launch a survey across the Episcopal Church, measuring in-person average Sunday attendance growth in relation to a bunch of different factors. So maybe if you're the rector of a parish, you've already received one of these surveys to fill out, and you will have seen there's over 100 questions in the survey, and they hope to get responses from at least 40% of all Episcopal parishes and missions. If you want to start seeing the results, they'll start being shared in July on Forward Movement's website. The idea, as I understood it, was to identify, well, they call them bright spots, quote unquote, places where things are going right in the Episcopal Church. And then to see if those good things can be applied in other places. That would be the next step. Instead of trying to, I'm quoting the article here, reverse engineer a solution to all the things that are going wrong. In other words, is there another perspective to see here rather than shrinking numbers? And when I was asking myself, what's the significance of this? Why is there another survey? How is this different from surveys in the past? What struck me is the hopes of what they're trying to get out of it, and there's the story that they're wanting to tell. So, for example, when we did the partner spotlights around the time of the pandemic, this is a feature we do in the September issue of our magazine that we've done for several years. Partner donors to the Living Church, we give them an opportunity to share 100 words about what's going on in their communities. And around the time of the pandemic, there were a lot of stories of devastation, of disasters, of people not coming to church. But also there was this sense that God was being faithful, that people were being creative, that they were longing for worship, and that there were these sprouts of new beginnings. But also there were stories of rising or even exploding ASA after the pandemic. I'm thinking of Trinity Parish in St. Augustine, Florida, that they built a new campus that now runs a total of 4 or 5 services every Sunday. So all of this to say, at the Living Church, we've been hearing anecdotes of growth for years, along with those stories and statistics of decline. This survey is saying, can we unearth what so far has been anecdotal growth? Can we unearth it in like data, facts, graphs, statistics? That's what I'm taking away from this as the significance. What do the both of you see about this survey? What's the significance here for you?
Well, I think in part this is helpful because it's a deep dive into the particular challenges and opportunities for the Episcopal Church. So I think it's often the case that the literature on church growth is written with different kinds of churches in mind than the kinds of churches that we as Episcopalians are called to lead. And so the survey, the advice are often so general that it's not that easy to understand. This is a massive project that Chris has undertaken. He's a man who deeply loves this church and who wants to see it thrive. And Forward Movement also, has just done so many wonderful things in the last couple of years to try to prioritize growth and vitality in congregational life. So this is going to be, I think, a really detailed study that will come up with lots of really helpful ideas. The other part of this, I think, for me is that when you talk to people about what makes a church grow or not grow, they usually blame it on the priest. There have been surveys that say that might be true, but your priest is often the hardest thing to change in your church. And so this is focusing on lots of other factors that don't have so much to do with the person who's standing at the altar on Sunday, so that it provides us with different kinds of solutions, different kinds of ways of looking at our church programs and the ways in which we can help them to focus more fully on reaching those who don't know Christ and who are not connected to his church. So I'm really excited about this. I've got the survey. I'm going to fill it out next week, and I'm glad to be a part of this important effort.
Yeah, I want to echo too. I mean, I'm very grateful to Forward Movement and their commitment to this kind of work, and their commitment not only to vitality in churches, but also to catechesis. If you hear Scott Gunn talk, I mean, he will very quickly pivot to one of the key solutions here. And in fact, all you priests are actually obligated to do this, is to form your people in basic Christian teaching and living. The Lordship of Jesus, the authority of the Bible in your life, a commitment to daily prayer, of reading the Bible, seeking to hear God's word for your life, of weekly gathering to receive communion with other Christians. This is what builds a healthy spiritual life. There's not a secret to this, but it requires teaching and commitment. The Episcopal Church releases data every year, obviously, related to ASA, these sorts of things. But this is, I think, important, a different kind of question to try to ask or ascertain what features have a clear effect on this growth. I'm sure they have demographers who are helping them deal with the data in a good way, because it's important to ask what are features that actually have no relationship to the growth but are incidental, or maybe actually a challenge. Like, what are the things that are actually making the positive effect? I think it's important that the Episcopal Church is starting to think in this way. I think it's also interesting that this work is happening not through the office of the presiding bishop or, as we sometimes call the national church. Important work for the church that's being done outside the bureaucracy of the General Convention. I think this may continue to be the case, that it's some of these kinds of, whatever we want to call them, parachurch organizations, that in this period of challenge and maybe decline, where the creative energy and work is going to be happening. It may also be the case, too, that we see that it is the centers of vitality where growth, church revitalization, and church planting, where the real energy is going to come, rather than from dioceses, actually from places of health who have a clearer, straighter line to bringing that health to other places, rather than a kind of bureaucratizing of attempting to bring health, a kind of more organic, familial, active relationship, straight line to revitalizing churches, replanting churches. Some of the larger churches we're seeing are already starting to do this. I mean, we're hearing anecdotal stories of healthy places being asked by dioceses to help revitalize a parish or to replant something. I think this is going to be one of the major stories of the next 30 to 50 years, is that healthy, vital churches are going to be replanting and revitalizing. and that the health of diocese, at least some kinds of diocese, are going to be directly tied to the healthy, vital church in that diocese.
I want to wrap us up today with a little segment I'd like to call insert sound effect here. Books and Culture Corner. I would like to know from each of you, and I'll throw myself in here as well, something that you would recommend for Eastertide, a personal reading, watching, listening, or tasting recommendation for Eastertide. I'm happy to start us out because I'm so eager to share this recipe that I've discovered. Okay, are you ready for this? This is a couple years ago, I was sitting in my house and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so hot. It was an apartment in Atlanta, so hot. And I was like, oh, I'd love a gin and tonic. And then it just came to my mind like a ratatouille moment. Oh my gosh, I'm going to make an elderflower gin and tonic. So this is my new spring Eastertide favorite. I love it every year. Saint Germain or some other kind of elderflower liqueur, elderflower tonic water, easily found at the grocery store, Fever Tree elderflower tonic water, and gin. If you don't drink alcohol, you could probably do like a lemonade, tonic water, or soda water, lemon juice combo. Squeeze a lot of lemon juice into it, stir it up, lots of ice. It is so refreshing, so springy, highly recommend. And definitely also recommend enjoying one on your porch with some friends and say Happy Easter to each other every time you take a drink. Maybe not. Maybe that's a silly thing to do. But what would you guys recommend?
Something that I received as a gift on Easter Sunday from friends from church who was also a work colleague, Jeffrey Williams, the founding musical director of New York Polyphony, made amazing lamb. He called them lamb lollipops, where he basically had lamb ribs that he then sliced and you just held, by the bone. And he made this amazing horseradish. And basically everyone just stood around saying, oh, this is so good. It was like the scene in What About Bob when he's at the dinner table and he's just exclaiming about Faye's cooking. Everyone was doing that. And, lamb is obviously traditional in Easter. And I got to say that was one of the highlights of our Easter Sunday meal that we shared with a couple families after the Easter Sunday service.
Okay, we've got our drink, we've got our meat. Mark, are you going to top us off with a dessert, or do you have something else completely different?
I guess I go a different direction. For me, the coming of spring sort of makes me want to go out and explore places, and so I often read some kind of a tale of a traveler or someone who goes and explores different places in the springtime. And I recently found an anthology of one of my favorite travel writers, Patrick Leigh Fermor, who's no longer traveling or writing, but it's a series of magazine articles that he wrote over the years, and it's kind of awakened my wanderlust again, and I'm thinking ahead to maybe some adventures in the summertime. But I suggest go find a book of travel stories that can help you think about places you'd like to go, things you'd like to see in the year that lies ahead.
He's actually the original Dos Equis man, right? He's actually the original most interesting man in the world.
He might be. He's definitely the most interesting man I've ever read about.
Well, next time you need some hard-hitting news and some incisive commentary and some great recipes and book recommendations, you know where to go. It's the Living Church Podcast. I'm at the Newsdesk today with the Reverend Dr. Matthew Olver, Executive Director and Publisher of The Living Church, and the Reverend Mark Michael, Editor-in-Chief of The Living Church Magazine. Links to everything we talked about today are going to be in the show notes. Thanks to all of us for being here with us today.
Thanks, Amber. This was great.
Terrific. This was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Living Church Podcast, a ministry of the Living Church. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. Learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. In 2 weeks, I'm joined by Eleanor Sanderson, Bishop of Hull in the Diocese of York, to talk about evangelism, young adult ministry, and the fascinating ministry of discipleship coaching. Until then, I'm Amber Noel, your host, and it's been good to be with you. Peace.